It began on a cliffside morning in late spring. The kind where the ocean mist hugs your skin and the wind smells like something between freedom and farewell. I stood barefoot on the edge of the wooden dock behind my grandmother's inn, the salt air tangling in my hair, and watched the waves crash against the rocks far below. That dock had been my sanctuary since I was 12, back when life was small, safe, mine. Now I was 26 and preparing to be given away like a favor being repaid. Not to a stranger exactly, but to a man whose name held more weight than his smile. Julian Blackthorne, a name that sounded like thunder wrapped in silk. Billionaire. Hotel empire heir, known for acquiring properties, outsmarting competitors, and never staying in one place for too long. He was also the man who had bought the unpaid debt on my family's inn. Every last cent, in exchange for something I hadn't even known was on the table. No, he didn't say it like that. He never said much at all. But when his lawyers arrived with the contract, when my grandmother's tearful thanks rang through the hallway, and when I saw my name printed beside his on the last page of that perfectly bound agreement, I understood. I was part of the deal. The terms were clean. 2 years, a marriage in name only, appearances for shareholders. A quiet divorce when the dust settled. In return, our inn, the only home I'd ever known, would be saved. My grandmother would stay. Her health bills would be handled, and I would disappear into the background of Julian Blackthorne's life. I signed the contract with shaking hands and didn't tell anyone that I felt like I had just signed away the last piece of myself. The engagement announcement was published in a column none of my friends read. The ring was discreet. The wedding was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks. Simple, strategic, silent. And then, the night before the ceremony, I disappeared. I didn't take much. Just a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a weathered leather journal, and a bus ticket north. I left a note for my grandmother that said only, "I'm sorry, but I need to remember who I am before I forget entirely." I didn't run because I hated Julian. I didn't even know him enough to feel that. I ran because I couldn't face the version of myself who could stand next to a man in a designer suit and smile while knowing I was nothing more than the fine print. In the small fishing town of Marrow Bay, I rented a room above a bookstore. I swept the floors in exchange for free coffee. I painted in the attic. I listened to the rain and convinced myself I was free, but even freedom has a cost. And mine came in the form of a single envelope slipped under my door for days later. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was familiar, elegant, distant, and sharp. The note said, "You don't owe me anything. I won't chase you. But if you ever want to talk, not as a contract, not as a performance, but as to people, you know where to find me. Noon, Friday." There was no return address, no demand, no ultimatum, just an invitation. I stayed up all night staring at the letter, and then, against every voice in my head, I returned. The inn looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had changed. My grandmother cried when she saw me, but didn't ask questions. She simply held me and said, "You always had your father's stubbornness." I didn't correct her. Julian was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, planting hydrangeas beside the porch. I stopped at the edge of the steps, unsure of what to say. He didn't look up. Instead, he said, "The wedding's off. You don't have to explain. But if you're here because you still care about the inn, there's something I'd like to show you." He stood, wiped his hands, and walked toward the trail behind the house. I followed. We ended up at the cliffside, the same place where I'd always gone to disappear. But this time, someone was already there waiting. "I never wanted a fake marriage," he said, his voice low, careful. "I just didn't know another way to keep you here long enough to matter." I should have felt manipulated, angry, but there was something raw in his voice, something I hadn't expected from a man who lived behind glass walls. "I'm not good at asking for what I want," he continued. "So I used money, I used power. I used the only tools I know." He turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw him, not the billionaire, not the tycoon. Just a man, tired, bruised, hoping. "I came back because I wanted to understand," I said. "Not because I forgave you." "That's enough," he replied, "for now." That evening, we sat on the inn's back porch and talked, not about the contract, not about obligations, but about the taste of childhood summers, the pain of losing parents too young, the hollow ache of being needed only for what you can provide. Over time, things began to shift. He didn't touch me, didn't try, but he was always around, fixing a broken step, replacing light bulbs, leaving a cup of chai on the windowsill when I couldn't sleep. I found a leather-bound notebook one morning on my bed with my name embossed on the cover. Inside the first page, he'd written, "Write the version of yourself you're afraid to say out loud. I'll read it when you're ready, or never, if that's what you prefer." So I wrote. I wrote about wanting to be more than a daughter, more than a caretaker. I wrote about wanting to travel, to paint, to scream into the sky and be heard. I didn't know when I began to fall, only that I did, one night. During a late walk through the garden, he reached for my hand. I let him, not because I was ready but because I wanted to try. Why me? I asked as the moon hung low above the cliffs. He didn't hesitate. Because you saw right through me, and you didn't flinch, and that was the night everything changed. The days after that night felt lighter but not without shadows. We were still walking a fragile path, stitched together by silence and cautious kindness. Julian remained guarded in the way people do when they've built walls to climb down from easily, but with every shared breakfast, every glance that lingered a second too long, I could feel those walls starting to shift. He surprised me with a visit to the old lighthouse near the harbor. I hadn't been there in years, but when we arrived, I found it had been restored, fresh paint, safe stairs, even working lights. I bought it, he said casually, as if it meant nothing. Thought it deserved to shine again. I turned to him, heart pounding. Why? He shrugged. Because sometimes we forget the things that used to guide us. Thought maybe you'd like a place that remembers. We climbed to the top, and there, above the waves, we shared our first real kiss. It wasn't cinematic or rushed. It was slow, aching and trembling with everything we hadn't said yet. When we pulled apart, I didn't look away. I didn't run. That night, I slept in the room beside his. But my dreams were full of warmth instead of fear. And for the first time since signing that contract, I felt like I had stepped into a story that belonged to me. Julian never asked for more. He let every emotion bloom at its own pace. There were evenings we sat reading in silence, mornings we cooked together in the tiny kitchen, laughing over burnt toast and spilled coffee. We were not perfect, but we were becoming something real. Then came the letter. It was from his father. Thick paper, cold words. Julian didn't want to show me at first, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided my eyes for hours. When I finally found it on his desk, unopened, I read it anyway. It wasn't just about business. It was a warning. A real man doesn't let emotion blind him. What you're building with that girl isn't strength, it's softness. And softness will be your undoing. I found Julian outside, standing by the broken garden fence. His hands clenched, eyes full of something between rage and grief. He never loved anything he couldn't control, he said. And I've spent my life making sure I wouldn't end up like him. You didn't, I whispered. But in the days that followed, something in Julian changed. He became distant again, not cruel, just cold, protective. The man I had feared in the beginning had returned. Not in his actions, but in his silence. I asked him what was wrong. He lied, not with his words, but with what he wouldn't say, and then he left. He said it was for work, just a week in New York, but I knew better. He was retreating. In his absence, the house felt hollow. My grandmother noticed. She'd always seen more than she let on. One evening, she sat beside me on the porch, a quilt over her lap and a mug of tea in her hands. You can't chase someone who's still chasing their ghosts, she said gently. But sometimes you can wait just long enough at the gate to be there when they stop running. Julian returned 5 days later, no warning, no suitcase, just him soaked in rain, standing on the porch like a man who had walked through a storm. That had nothing to do with weather. I'm scared, he said quietly. I blinked. Of what? Of being enough, he whispered. For you, for myself. Of building something real and not knowing how to keep it. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. You don't have to know how to keep it, you just have to not run from it. And he did in single quotes. Not again. From that moment forward, everything changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like spring melting into summer. Soft and almost imperceptible unless you paid attention, and I was paying attention. Now, to everything, to the quiet way Julian began to linger in doorways as I passed. To the way he started asking real questions, not just about the inn, but about me, my art, my past, my fears. One evening, I took him up the attic steps to show him the studio I had carved out for myself. The space was small, still scented with dust and turpentine, but the light through the cracked window turned everything golden. This is where I remember who I am, I told him. He stood silently, gazing at the half-finished painting of the cliffside, of the lighthouse, of the sea. You're incredible, he said, barely a whisper. I've never seen the world this way before. No one ever wanted to, I replied. I do, he said, and I believed him. That night, we didn't touch, we didn't kiss. We simply sat on the wooden floor of the attic until the moon shifted. I fell asleep with my head on his shoulder, and in the morning, I woke with his jacket wrapped around me, still warm. But love, real love, doesn't come without fear. One morning, a reporter showed up at the inn, young, eager, charming but invasive. Julian wasn't there. I answered the door. Miss Ward, he said, too friendly. Some say you were bought, that this marriage was a business transaction, that Mr. Blackthorne added your name to his empire the same way he adds a hotel on paper and for profit. I didn't slam the door. I should have, but I looked him in the eyes and said, Then maybe it's time someone rewrote that story. Later that night, I told Julian. He went still. The storm I expected didn't come. No shouting, no damage control, just quiet devastation. You should have never been dragged into my world, he said. I walked into it. I reminded him. I'm still here. He looked at me, and this time he didn't blink. And if I asked you to stay, not for the contract, not for the inn, not for the illusion, but for me, would you? My throat tightened. I think I already am. He kissed me then, no hesitation, no performance, just us, skin to skin, soul to soul. And in that kiss was every fear we'd both carried dissolving. The following weeks were like a dream. We worked side by side restoring the inn for the summer guests. We drank wine on the roof beneath strings of Edison bulbs. We danced in the kitchen barefoot to old records. He found me a vintage typewriter and set it beside my bed. I painted a portrait of the lighthouse with a sky filled not with stars, but with the words I was too afraid to say out loud. One morning, he handed me a folded newspaper. Front page, a full feature, the inn that wasn't bought but saved, my story, our truth. I asked him how he pulled it off. I have a few favors left in this world, he said, smiling. And this one was worth using. I didn't cry. Not then, but that night, while brushing my teeth, I looked at my reflection and whispered, "You're not invisible anymore." The season shifted. Summer gave way to the first hints of autumn. Tourists thinned, waves grew heavier, and the mornings came wrapped in fog. But something inside me had started to clear. Julian was no longer just the man who saved the inn. He had become the man who taught me that love was not a chain, but a choice. He never asked me for more than I could give. He never rushed the silence or tried to fill it with promises. He simply showed up day after day with a steady presence and an open door. Still, I carried the final question, the one I was too afraid to say aloud. What happens when the contract ends? It sat between us like a sealed envelope, untouched but known. One evening, as the fireplace cracked softly and Julian sat with a book on the couch beside me, I closed my own journal and looked at him. "Do you ever think about the end date?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Every day," and he set the book down, turned to me, "And I hope it never comes. But I won't trap you again. I want you here. Only if it's real." I stared at him, breath shallow. "It's real," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we burn the contract." He stood, walked to the old desk drawer, and pulled out the original paper, still sealed in its folder, still bound by signatures and legal weight. He held it up and asked, "May I?" I nodded. And we burned it together in the hearth that had once warmed generations of my family. The fire snapped and sparked, and the ashes drifted upward like forgotten chains breaking into dust. Later that night, he found me standing on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the stars. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart stumbled. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. "Not yet." Inside was a delicate necklace, a silver chain with a compass pendant. "So you always know where home is," he said. I took it, fingers trembling, and slipped it around my neck. "You keep giving me pieces of myself," I whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from my cheek. "That's all I ever wanted to do." Autumn deepened. The trees outside the inn turned copper and gold. I spent mornings painting, afternoons reading letters from guests who had returned because they'd read our story, and nights falling asleep with the scent of Julian on the pillow beside mine. But peace never stays unchallenged. A letter arrived, this one from a development firm in New York, offering Julian a merger deal that would require him to relocate. It was lucrative, strategic, the kind of deal that made empires. I found him standing in the garden that evening, the letter in his hand. "You should go," I said before he could speak. He looked at me, startled. "I mean it," I continued. "If this is what you've been building toward, don't stay here for me." "I'm not staying for you," he said. "I'm staying because I finally found something worth building that doesn't need skyscrapers to prove it exists." "You always have a way with words," I said, "but only when they're for you." The first snowfall came early that year, tiny flakes at first, scattered like confetti across the rooftops, then heavier, steadier, the kind of snow that muffles the world and slows time. The inn looked like something out of a postcard. Warm lights glowing through frosted windows, smoke curling from the chimney, a wreath on the door made from dried lavender and pinnacones. Julian had made it himself, his fingers covered in sap, his expression both amused and slightly embarrassed. When I caught him crafting it in secret, it was the week before Christmas when my grandmother called me into her room. Her voice was softer now, her body more fragile, but her mind sharp as ever. "You were always so afraid of giving your heart," she said. "But I've never seen your eyes shine the way they do when he walks into a room." "I didn't plan for any of this," I said. "No one plans for real love," she replied. "It just shows up and refuses to leave." She reached into her drawer and handed me a small velvet pouch. Your grandfather gave me this the day we opened the inn. I want you to have it. Inside was a gold hairpin shaped like a feather, elegant, simple, timeless. I think you're about to write your own beginning, she whispered that night. Julian took me on a walk through the woods behind the inn. The path was lined with lanterns, their glow soft against the snow at the clearing near the lighthouse. The snow had been brushed away to reveal a circle of candles. In the middle stood a table with 2 mugs of cider, a blanket, and a ring box. He turned to me, heart pounding visible in his chest. This isn't about ownership or contracts or repayment. He said, this is about the version of myself. I never thought I'd become the version who believes in mornings together and messy kitchens and arguments that end with I'm sorry. This is about the woman who taught me how to be still and how to stay. He dropped to one knee. I don't want a story that starts with a contract. I want one that starts with a question. Sienna Ward, will you marry me not because you have to, but because you want to? Tears spilled down my cheeks. I knelt with him. Only if you promise to burn every contract you ever write from now on, I whispered. He laughed, shaking, and kissed me. The snow fell heavy around us, blanketing the earth in silence. But inside my heart, something bloomed, a beginning. A yes, a home. The wedding wasn't lavish. There were no headlines, no designer gowns, no orchestra playing beneath chandeliers, just us. A snowy January morning, my grandmother's laughter echoing down the stairs. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen, a white lace dress I found in a secondhand shop, and Julian in a gray wool coat, waiting for me in the old garden where the hydrangeas had first bloomed. We said our vows beneath a wooden arch I had painted myself. Wrapped in winter vines and soft fairy lights, the guests were few, just family, a few close friends, and the town locals who had come to love us both. The vows were simple, raw. Mine ended with, you were never the man who bought my future. You were the man who gave it back to me, one heartbeat at a time. Julian's eyes shone as he said, and you were never the girl who ran. You were the one who taught me how to stop running. We kissed as the snow began to fall again, soft and silent. And I knew then, truly knew, that love was never about escape. It was about coming home. In the weeks that followed, we didn't go on a honeymoon. Instead, we stayed at the inn, restoring, laughing, planning. We converted the old greenhouse into an art studio for me. And Julian began designing a writing retreat for others who had once lost their voice like I had. My grandmother's health stabilized. She called it a miracle. I called it peace. Sometimes Julian would find me staring out at the lighthouse. That old place that once felt like a boundary between who I was and who I was allowed to become. Want to go up? He'd ask, and I'd nod. From the top, we could see everything: the sea, the town, the garden we built with our hands and hearts, the inn, now full of stories and light again, and the future, wide and open and waiting. I kept my compass necklace on, not because I needed to find my way, but because it reminded me that I had already arrived. I still painted, still wrote. Julian still brought me chai every morning, even when I didn't ask. He kissed my forehead when he passed me in the hallway. He danced with me in the kitchen when no one was watching, and every time he looked at me like I was a miracle he'd never expected. I felt something deep inside me whisper, this is yours. This love, this life, this beginning. And even now, years later, when people ask how we met, we laugh. Because the truth is, our story didn't begin with love. It began with fear. But it bloomed into everything I never dared to hope for, because sometimes the man you think you have to run from is the only one who's ever really been running toward you. And all it takes is the courage to stop. Turn around. And see him.